The day Miriam Okafor walked into St. Luke's Children's Hospital for the 43rd time, she didn't bring flowers or balloons or the kind of cheerful things people carry when they visit the sick. She brought a thermos of soup she'd made the night before, barley and carrot, the same recipe her grandmother had used when Miriam was small and running a fever on the reserve outside Thunder Bay. She brought it because it was all she had, and because the boy in room 214 hadn't been eating. Nobody had asked her to come. That was the thing people never quite understood when she tried to explain it later. Nobody had sent her. There was no obligation, no paperwork, no arrangement. She simply came, the way some people go to church, not because they expect anything in return, but because something in them requires it. Miriam was 11 years old. She lived 20 minutes from the hospital by bus, in a 2-bedroom apartment above a Vietnamese restaurant on Dundas Street West. The apartment smelled always of pho and her uncle's cigarettes, and the radiator knocked every night around 2 in the morning like a tenant trying to get out. She shared a room with her younger cousin, Della, who was 7 and still afraid of the dark. Miriam's mother had died 2 years earlier, a clot in her lung, fast and without warning, the kind of thing doctors call massive and families call impossible. After that, Miriam had come to live with her uncle Renford and his wife, Gloria, who were kind people doing their best with too little space and too little money and too much grief of their own. The hospital was not on Miriam's way to school. It was not on her way to anywhere. She had started coming the previous autumn when a classmate's little brother was admitted for something the teachers called serious without saying what. Miriam had gone once with her class to drop off cards. She had stayed because of the boy in the bed next to her classmate's brother, a pale, slight boy with dark circles under his eyes and a book open on his lap that he wasn't reading. He had looked at her the way some children look at something they haven't seen in a long time, like sunlight after a run of gray days. His name was Calloway, not his last name, but what everyone called him. His first name was Frederick. But he'd told her with complete seriousness on their second meeting that Frederick was a name for someone who wore waistcoats, and he did not own any waistcoats. He was 12. He had been in the hospital for 4 months by the time Miriam met him, waiting for a liver transplant that kept not coming. His own liver was failing in the slow, particular way that is harder in some respects than the fast kind, hard enough that each day felt like a negotiation, but not hard enough that the situation was considered immediately critical. He existed in a middle place, and that middle place had its own particular loneliness. His mother had died when he was 3. His father, a man named Douglas Hale, whom Calloway referred to only as my father, in the careful, neutral way of a child who has learned to be careful, worked long hours and visited on weekends. Beyond that, Calloway had the nurses and the television mounted high on the wall, and his books, and now, increasingly, Miriam. She told him about the reserve near Thunder Bay, which she had only visited twice, but remembered with the specific vividness of places that feel important. She told him about her mother. Not often, and not at length, but enough that Calloway understood this was someone whose absence shaped everything. He told her about his father, about the way the man arrived on Saturdays with magazines Calloway hadn't asked for, and left after an hour looking relieved. He said it without bitterness, which Miriam thought was either very mature or very sad, and she wasn't sure which. What she did not know, what she had no reason to know, sitting on the vinyl chair beside his bed with her thermos of barley soup, was anything at all about Douglas Hale's life outside those Saturday visits. She knew he wore a good coat. She knew he had a phone that was newer than any phone she'd ever seen up close. She knew he sometimes brought Calloway things that seemed expensive without being wanted. Beyond that, she had formed only the impression of a man who did not know how to be present, which was different from a man who did not care, though she understood those two things could look identical from a distance. She did not know that Douglas Hale was the founder of Hale Capital, one of the largest private equity firms in Ontario. She did not know that his name appeared regularly in the business section of the Globe and Mail, that he sat on 3 hospital boards, that he had given a wing of this very building, this building where his son was slowly failing. 20 years ago, when he was young and newly wealthy and believed that money placed correctly could solve most things. She did not know that the wing was named after his mother. She did not know any of this because she was 11 years old and read the art section of the newspaper, when she read it at all. And Douglas Hale had never thought to mention any of it to the girl who brought his son barley soup. It was in November on a Thursday that had turned dark and cold by 3 in the afternoon the way Toronto Novembers do, that the doctor told Calloway his numbers were worse. Miriam was there. She had not been invited to be there. She had arrived just before the doctor, and nobody had thought to ask her to leave, and she had made herself as small as possible in the corner chair while the words were said. She watched Calloway's face while the doctor spoke. He had a particular expression he used for difficult information, a kind of polite, attentive stillness, like he was taking notes internally. She'd seen it before when nurses did procedures, when blood was drawn, when results were discussed in the doorway in voices that were meant to be quiet and weren't. After the doctor left, he was quiet for a long time. "Calloway, I heard," he said. He was looking at the ceiling. "I know you heard." Another silence. Outside, the wind pressed at the window. "I'm not scared," he said, in a voice that made absolutely clear he was scared. "I know," she said. She didn't tell him it would be fine. She had been told things would be fine about her mother, and they hadn't been, and she had decided after that never to tell something would be fine unless she had genuine reason to believe it. What she said instead was, "I'll come tomorrow." "You don't have to. I know I don't have to." She came the next day, and the day after. She came on the weekend, even though the buses ran differently, and she had to transfer twice. She sat with him while he slept, and while he read, and while he watched things on the television he didn't seem to enjoy. She brought soup when she had the ingredients, and crackers from the corner store on days she didn't, and once, memorably, a small clay bird she had made in art class that looked nothing like a bird, but which Calloway placed on his bedside table and seemed to consider a significant object. It was in December that she asked Dr. Anand about compatibility. She had looked it up first, several evenings on the library computer near school, reading about living donor transplants in careful, methodical detail. She understood that it was possible to donate a portion of a liver from a living person. She understood that the liver regenerated. She understood that the donor needed to be evaluated, blood type, tissue matching, overall health, size. She understood that for a child donor to be considered, there would need to be exceptional circumstances and very specific legal and medical approvals. She had made notes. The notes were in a small purple notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. She asked Dr. Anand on a Tuesday morning when Calloway was having a scan, and the ward was quieter than usual. She was polite and direct and held her notebook in both hands. "Dr. Anand," a woman in her 50s with an expression that had learned over decades to be both professional and human at once, looked at her for a long moment. "Miriam," she said carefully, "do you understand what you're asking?" "Yes," said Miriam. "I looked it up. I know it's complicated. It's more than complicated. You're a child. I'm 11. Calloway is 12. He's been here since August." Dr. Anand was quiet. Then she said, "Why?" Miriam thought about it. It was a fair question. She had thought about it herself, at length in the dark after Della fell asleep, listening to the radiator knock. "My mum died because nobody had a liver to give her," she said. "She was on a list." The list didn't move fast enough. She held the notebook a little tighter. "I don't want that to happen to him." Dr. Anand looked at her for a long time. Something moved in her expression. Not pity, which Miriam would have disliked, but something closer to recognition, the look of a person encountering something they hadn't expected. "I can't make any promises," Dr. Anand said. "There's a process, there are rules, and they exist for good reasons. You would need your guardian's consent. You would need to be fully evaluated. And you need to understand that the outcome isn't guaranteed either way." "I know," said Miriam. "Can we start the process?" The call came on a Wednesday evening. Gloria answered the phone and stood very still in the kitchen for a long time before she came to find Miriam at the kitchen table doing homework. She sat down across from her niece and looked at her with the complicated expression of a woman who has simultaneously received extraordinary news and understood that it has arrived in a form she cannot simply manage or contain. "A doctor from St. Luke's called," Gloria said. Miriam closed her textbook. "She explained what you asked about," Gloria said. "She explained what it would involve." She folded her hands on the table. She had large, capable hands, a bit like Miriam's mother's hands, and Miriam had always found this comforting even when it also made her sad. "Why didn't you talk to us first?" I wasn't sure if it was possible yet, Miriam said. I didn't want to ask for something that might not happen. Gloria looked at her for a long time. She was not a woman who cried easily, but her eyes were doing something complicated. Renford is going to ask if you've lost your mind, she said. What are you going to say? Gloria was quiet for a moment. I'm going to say she knows exactly what she's doing. She reached across the table and covered Miriam's hand with her own. I'm going to say she's her mother's daughter. The evaluation took 3 weeks. It involved blood tests and imaging and consultations with a pediatric surgeon named Dr. Marchetti, who asked Miriam many questions in a careful, probing way, the way adults ask questions when they're trying to determine if a child actually understands something or only thinks they do. He asked what she thought would happen. He asked if anyone had pressured her. He asked what she would do if it didn't work. She answered everything honestly, including that last one, which she'd had to think about for a moment. If it doesn't work, she said, I'll still have tried. That matters to me. Dr. Marchetti looked at his notes. He had kind eyes behind rectangular glasses. You understand that you'll have scars. Yes, permanent ones. Yes, and a recovery period of several weeks. You'd miss school. I've already talked to my teachers. She paused. The school counselor cried, which I didn't expect. Something happened at the corner of Dr. Marchetti's mouth. All right, he said. I'll say this, you're a remarkably healthy 11-year-old. Your blood type is compatible. Your tissue markers are close enough that we'll need to look carefully at the imaging. He paused. Indicators are, choosing words, not unfavorable. The blood type result was what brought Dr. Anand to Douglas Hale's office on a Friday afternoon in the 3rd week of December. He had not been told about Miriam before that day. He came on Saturdays with his magazines. He did not stay for weekday afternoons. He did not know the girl who sat in the corner chair and brought soup. He knew in the abstract that Calloway had a friend who visited. One of the nurses had mentioned it once, approvingly, and he had nodded and moved on to asking about the latest labs. He was in a meeting when Dr. Anand arrived, and he stepped out of it with the particular wariness of a man who has spent months expecting the worst kind of news and now lives in a state of low but constant dread. When she told him not the worst news but an unexpected kind, he stood very still in his glass-walled boardroom above the financial district and looked out at the winter sky and did not speak for a long time. She's 11, he finally said. Yes, and she just asked, on her own. On her own. With a notebook, she'd done her research. Douglas Hale had spent 22 years building things. He had spent 22 years making decisions, large decisions, decisions that moved money and companies and people in significant ways. He was not, by the assessment of most people who knew him professionally, a sentimental man. He was precise and strategic, and he kept his personal life separated from his work with the kind of discipline that looks like health from the outside and sometimes isn't. He asked to meet her. They met in a small consultation room off the main ward on a Saturday morning in January, after Calloway had fallen asleep mid-morning, which he did often now. Douglas Hale arrived in his good coat and sat across from an 11-year-old girl in a burgundy sweater with a small hole near the left cuff. He had prepared things to say. He had them arranged, more or less, in order. He looked at her and forgot most of them. Why? He asked, which was what everyone asked, and which Miriam had developed an answer to, though it always felt incomplete. She told him about her mother, about the list that didn't move fast enough. She told it plainly, without drama, the way she had told it to Dr. Anand, and he listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet. Then he said, You know I can't let you do this. I know you want to say that, Miriam said, but the decision isn't really yours. He blinked. It was the expression of a man who was rarely spoken to that directly. Miriam, I've been evaluated. The preliminary results are compatible. My uncle and aunt have given consent. The hospital has a process and we're going through it. She looked at him calmly. You can ask me not to, but you can't stop it. Douglas Hale looked at her for a long time. Something moved in his face. Something that was not quite what his face usually did. Something that had not been exercised in a while. What if something happens to you? He asked, and his voice was different from before. Lower, less arranged. What if something happens to Calloway? She said. He had no answer for that. The surgery was scheduled for the 14th of February, a date nobody planned, one that arrived by its own logic, and the 2 weeks before it were, for Miriam, both the longest and the most specific of her life. She continued going to school. She continued visiting Calloway, who had been told in a careful conversation involving both Dr. Anand and his father, and who had cried for the first time in Miriam's presence, which she had not known how to respond to except to sit beside him and wait. "You don't have to," he said, for perhaps the 4th or 5th time since she'd started asking. "I know," she said, for the 4th or 5th time. "Why, though? Really? Not the thing about your mum." She thought about it. Outside the window, the winter was still hard, February in Toronto, flat and grey and cold in a way that felt like it had always been and would always be cold, though you knew, distantly, that this wasn't true. "Because I'd want someone to," she said finally. "If it were me." He turned the clay bird over in his hands, the little lopsided thing she'd made in September, which had sat on his bedside table through autumn and winter without once being moved. "I'm going to be scared," he said. "Me too," she said. "But we can be scared at the same time. That's different from being scared alone." The morning of the surgery was a Thursday. Gloria braided Miriam's hair the way her mother used to, in 2 plaits down the back, and didn't say much, and held her face in both hands for a moment before they left the apartment. Renford drove them. He was a quiet man, who expressed things through actions rather than words, and that morning he carried Miriam's bag and opened the car door and put a Tim Hortons hot chocolate in the cup holder without being asked, because he had noticed somewhere along the way that it was what she liked on cold mornings. At the hospital, Douglas Hale was already there. He was standing in the corridor outside the surgical floor in his coat, and when Miriam came off the elevator, he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, stripped of the careful arrangement that usually covered his face. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been sitting with something very large and wasn't sure what to do with it. He bent down, which was awkward because he was tall and she was not, and he said, "I want you to know something." He paused. "Whatever happens today, whatever." He stopped, tried again. "You already gave him more than I knew how to. The visiting, the souped, just being here." He straightened up and cleared his throat. "I want you to know that doesn't get lost, whatever happens." Miriam looked at him. "It's going to be okay," she said. He blinked. "You don't know that." "No," she agreed, "but I wanted to say it to you." She was taken in at 8:43 in the morning. The anesthetic was faster than she expected. She'd thought there would be more of a gap between the moment and the next, but there wasn't. There was the operating room, bright and precise, and smelling of something antiseptic and neutral, and there were voices that were calm and professional, and addressed her by name, and then there was nothing. In the other operating room, Calloway was already under. Douglas Hale sat in the waiting area with Renford and Gloria for 7 hours. This was not a planned arrangement. He had arrived intending to stay an hour, and then return to his office, where he had 3 calls scheduled and a proposal due by end of day. None of those things happened. He sat in a plastic chair beside a man he'd just met, and a woman who had brought a container of homemade butter tarts, and offered him one at the 2-hour mark without ceremony, and he ate it because it seemed rude not to, and he sat there while the afternoon moved past the windows and the light changed. He did not make his calls. He texted his assistant, briefly, and then put the phone in his pocket. At the 5-hour mark, Gloria said, without looking up from her knitting. She talked about Calloway every time she came home from visiting. From the first week, she never asked for anything. She just talked about him like he was someone she'd known a long time. Douglas Hale was quiet for a moment. "She's been visiting since September?" he said. "Since October," Gloria said. "Almost every day." He absorbed this. He thought about the Saturdays, the 1 day a week he came, the magazines he brought that weren't quite right, the hour he managed before something in him grew restless and retreated. He thought about a girl in a burgundy sweater showing up every day on a bus that didn't run directly, carrying soup. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't," said Gloria, without judgment. Dr. Marchetti came out at 4:17. Both surgeries had gone well. Calloway's new liver segment was accepting. Miriam was in recovery and her vitals were stable, and she was expected to wake within the hour. He said the words with professional calm and then, apparently despite himself, added, "She's a remarkable kid." Douglas Hale stood outside recovery for 20 minutes before a nurse, a young woman named Priya, who had been on Calloway's ward since August and knew the situation better than most, took pity on him and let him in. Miriam was awake, more or less. She was the color of old paper, and her eyes were at half-mast, and she looked, Douglas thought, very small in the hospital bed, smaller than she'd ever looked when she was vertical, and looking at him with those direct, serious eyes. "Calloway," she said, before she said anything else. "He's okay," Douglas said. "He's in recovery too, everything went well." She closed her eyes for a moment, let out a breath. "Good," she said. He sat in the chair beside her bed, the vinyl chair that he recognized from Calloway's room, the same model, the same slight give when you sat, and he stayed there while she drifted in and out of the anesthetic haze. At some point she said, half asleep, "Did you eat?" He frowned. "What? You look like you didn't eat." He almost said something dismissive and then didn't. "Gloria gave me a butter tart," he said. "That's not a meal." "No," he agreed. She made a small sound that might have been a laugh. Then she was asleep again. The recovery took 5 weeks. Miriam went home after 10 days with instructions and medications and a follow-up schedule that Gloria managed with the precise organizational energy she applied to everything she considered important. Calloway was discharged 3 weeks later, walking out of St. Luke's on a cold March morning with his father beside him, and a look on his face of someone who has been inside for a long time and is re-encountering the fact of open sky. In the months that followed, things changed in ways that were gradual and then seemed sudden when you looked back. Douglas Hale began visiting on Tuesdays as well as Saturdays, not at the hospital now, but at Miriam's school, where he had arranged with Gloria and Renford to take her for dinner once a week at a restaurant near the school that Miriam had selected on the grounds that it had good soup. He brought Calloway, who was in school again now, and had the slightly dazed quality of someone who has been handed their life back and is still figuring out what to do with it. The three of them sat in a booth every Tuesday and ate soup, or Calloway and Douglas ate soup, while Miriam ate whatever else she wanted, because she had decided she'd earned the right to eat something other than soup for a while, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with hospitals. In April, Douglas Hale's lawyers sent Renford a document. Renford called Douglas directly, which took some courage, because Douglas Hale was not someone most people called directly, and said, "I'm not sure what this is." "It's a trust," Douglas said, "in Miriam's name, for her education and whatever she needs after that. I'd like to set it up properly if you and Gloria are willing." Renford was quiet for a moment. "She won't like feeling like it's a transaction," he said. "I know," Douglas said. "That's why it's not framed as one. It's framed as—" He paused, searching. "It's framed as something I'm doing because I want to, because I can, because she didn't ask for anything and I have more than I need, and she should have the chance to be whatever she's going to be, without money being the thing that stops her." Renford was quiet again. "Then, she wants to be a doctor." "I know," Douglas said. "She told me." And then, in a voice that was a little different from the one he usually used, "She told me she wants to work with children, hospital kids, the ones who are waiting." In June, on a Saturday morning that was finally warm, properly warm, the kind of warm that makes Toronto feel like it was worth it, the long winter worth it, the gray spring worth it, Douglas drove Miriam and Calloway to the waterfront. It was Calloway's idea, technically. He had asked his father if they could go, the way he asked his father things now, more directly than before, in the voice of someone who had learned that asking was worth the risk. They walked along the lake. Calloway walked fast, the way he'd apparently always walked before he got sick and had forgotten he could walk that way again. Miriam walked slightly slower, still sometimes conscious of the scar beneath her jacket, not painful anymore. Just present, the way some things become part of you not by being painful, but simply by being there. Douglas walked between them, or sometimes behind them, watching the two of them argue pleasantly about something to do with a television show. And he thought about the word that kept arriving in his mind without having been invited. Family. It wasn't a word he'd used carelessly even before everything. He'd stopped using it easily when Calloway's mother died and the shape of the word had changed. But here it was again, arriving without ceremony on a warm June morning by the lake. Two children walking ahead of him, one who was his and one who had walked into his son's life, carrying soup she didn't have to make, spending time she didn't have to spend, giving something she didn't have to give. He thought about Gloria saying she talks about him like she's known him a long time. He thought about Miriam in the recovery room, half-conscious, asking if he had eaten. He thought about the clay bird on the bedside table. Calloway had brought it home from the hospital. It sat on his desk now in his room, in the apartment where Douglas had started staying more often, because it turned out he was also good at being present. When he decided to stop running from the things he didn't know how to hold, he caught up to them at the railing where they'd stopped to look at the lake. The water was very blue. Farther out, a sailboat was making slow progress in the light wind. "It's pretty here," Miriam said. "Yeah," said Calloway. They stood there for a while, the three of them, watching the light on the water. Nobody said anything important. Nobody needed to. Some things settle into place, not with ceremony but with quiet. Not with a pronouncement but with a moment, ordinary and specific and yours, where you look around at what you have, and the people beside you, and you understand, without needing to explain it, that this is where you belong. Miriam looked out at the lake and felt the sun on her face and thought about her mother, the way she often did in good moments. Because her mother had taught her that good moments were the ones worth holding. She thought that wherever her mother was, she would understand this. The soup, the bus rides, the notebook with its careful research, the scar she now carried like a small, quiet fact about herself. She had not expected any of this. She had only expected to be useful. It turned out that was the thing, all along, that had made all the difference.